Luddite Romantic made a video, and the video irritated me not because of the video, but because of the comments. Right? Luddite Romantic was talking about how the fall of Christianity, people are trying to find meaning. Okay, and then you had all these post-Christians like Hannibal the Victor, Dana Garrett, Sausage for Smash saying, yeah, yeah, good video. What I want to point out is these kinds of people are the post-Christians. In that I would say that what is called quote-unquote progressivism is really just a secularization of Christianity. Okay. From a historical institutional standpoint, we can look at where the universities came from. The universities, of course, came from the monastery and cathedral schools. You had monastery and cathedral schools starting in Spain around 500 AD, spreading to France, England, Italy. Over time, these cathedral schools, they started off basically to teach the clergy, to learn Latin, geometry, obviously a lot of theology, the Bible, some accounting, some law, all the things you need to do to manage a parish. Over time, these cathedral schools became more ordered, organized, and they would start off, at the very beginning, they wouldn't be a building like we know today. There would be an area around the cathedral. There'd be an area in a town called the Latin Quarter, because they spoke Latin. And they would teach classes out in fields, in rented rooms. And what people would do is they would go to the cathedral school and they would take several courses and they would copy the professor's textbook. And so this system, this university system or cathedral school system, was developed for a time when books were not widely available. So once you had the printing press, this model should have been done for. Like, there's no... I mean, I guess you could argue that having a teacher is a bit helpful, but, I mean, costs benefits. Is it really worth the hassle of all that? Is it really worth the cost, the years of time, when you could just get a book? Right? I understand, before books, it's difficult, but once you have books, it's basically an obsolete thing. And the lie to this is that when you want to learn something for real, you don't go find a class for it. You go get a book and you learn it in earnest. Right? When you actually want to learn a specific thing, nobody goes through the course system. And of course, I mean, if you look at, for example, Harvard today, there's lots of people trying to fake Harvard diplomas and all that stuff, but no one's really trying to fake the education, right? No one's trying to, sneak into classes just to get the education for its own sake. No, they're trying to get the diploma, right? I mean, it's not, the whole idea of the college system for learning itself, for actually the utility of it, is kind of a joke at this point. And also, job performance studies have shown that college has no real effect. One's a control for IQ and an integrity test, aside from the STEMs, and even that's not nearly as much as you might think. For example, in programming, you have to learn C, you have to learn Fortran. I mean, that's irrelevant. That doesn't help you with the job. But there are some STEMs where actually going out and learning the specific skill helps you with the job a little bit. But 95% of people who get a college degree, that college degree is not going to help them in reality. Even in some where you might think, like accounting, you learn old accounting practices that are obsolete. Anyway, so I mean, the university, and if you look at, say, Harvard, for example, Harvard was founded explicitly to teach the clergy in the New World, right? Because they came to the New World. There were most of the people who founded Harvard went to Cambridge, and they came to the New World, and they were worried. Well, once we die off, who's going to be able to perform clerical duties in the next generation? Well, there's no university here, so we need to found a university, and that's why Harvard was founded. This is not some conspiracy or big secret. This is stated right on Harvard's website. Okay, so yeah, the origin of Harvard is religious, and to this day, Harvard still has a theology school, which is a source of some amusement. Okay, so from what is Christianity? Well, Christianity is monotheistic and it is universalist. It is not an ethnicity-specific religion. In fact, it broke from ethnicity-specific religions. One in particular, Judaism. Before monotheism, you had Greek city-states, Mesopotamian city-states. Before the unification of Egypt, you had the Egyptian city-states. But even once Egypt was unified, they still had a pantheon. They weren't monotheistic even when they were unified. But before that, you had city-states in Egypt. Each city would have its patron deity, or it may not be just a single city, maybe a city in outlying areas, and there'd be one main city and a few minor cities that all have the same patron deity. Whatever. You had patron deities for the city-states. These were ethnicity or, group-specific religions. Judaism was initially just another one of these religions. And then, when the Jews left Egypt, they told tall tales about how they were enslaved. They weren't enslaved, they were actually mercenaries, I believe. They left Egypt, and on their way out, they started ransacking Egyptian villages in order to get the supplies they needed to get out, and in response to this, the Pharaoh sent some armies to go. Anyway, but what Judaism became was a monotheistic religion, in that they declared their God, Yahweh, which was originally just the God of the Hebrews. They declared Yahweh as the one and the only God, and there would be no idols before this God. There are no other gods. He was the one, true, and only God, right? And the Jews, surprise, surprise, were this God's chosen people, right? It's a very supremacist religion from the outset. Over time, the whole Jewish exceptionalism kind of faded, and Christianity evolved into a more universalist thing, where all will be judged before heaven by their deeds and or their acceptance of Jesus' sacrifice, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So in the Western world, this idea of a universal religion comes from Christianity. There are other places in the world that also have universalist religions that are not Christian in origin. So I'm not saying that Christianity is the only example of a universalist religion. I'm just saying that it is the one that won out in the West. Okay. Now, the idea of universalism is kind of silly, right? The idea that one should advocate or look at the world from the point of view of what benefits all humanity. That is a very strange, or some take it even further, to all life. But if we just limit ourselves to humanism, right? Human universalism, looking, if, for example, from a policy standpoint, what policy benefits all of humanity. This is an obviously dumb idea, because, well, here's a really quick and dirty way to explain why it's dumb. Okay, let's say I have 10 kids, I can't raise them. Right, so now you pay for my kids because I can't pay for them. Right, if you want to say, for example, well, universal utility, let's give everyone free education, free healthcare, all children have a right to an opportunity. Oh, all children have a right to an opportunity? Okay, I have 10 kids, pay for them now. See? So, and when you look at the world, well, when you recognize that everyone is someone else's kid, what becomes obvious is that any form of welfare is a form of child support for someone else's kid. That kid, quote unquote, may be 40. Okay, so it's still someone's kid. The reason you are paying, for this person is because some time ago, two other people chose to, form the beast with two backs and have a kid. And so now you are being required to pay. Right? That is the logic of any welfarism. That is the logic of any kind of New Dealism or the social democracy welfare state, which comes from this idea of universal utility, that we should not look at the world from the point of view of our narrow group interests, but have a broader view. Look at the world from the point of view of all humanity, the utility of all humanity. So this universalist utilitarianism has a profound impact on policy. And in my opinion, it's a very stupid view. for the basic reason I just described. And of course, what it does is it leads to an insane situation where the breeders basically inherit the earth. Whichever group pumps out the most kids, well, they now become humanity, right? Because, one person is just as equally valuable as all other people, okay? So whichever group, okay, has the most kids, their concerns become paramount. Because they now, by, pumping out the most kids, they now constitute the most of humanity. Right? For example, I believe in 1950, well, let's just take two countries. It doesn't matter if the numbers are exact. But I think in like 1950, let's say Sub-Saharan Africa had 200 million people. Britain had 50 million people. Today, Sub-Saharan Africa has around 900 million people, and Britain has around 60 million people. So now, are the concerns of Sub-Saharan Africa that many times more important relative to the concerns of Britain because they happen to have so many more kids? Well, that's the logic. That is the logical conclusion of universalist utility. One man equals one person. So, LaQuisha has her 8 kids. Each one of her kid is just as valuable as your one kid, right? And her kids in total, all 8 of them, are 8 times as valuable as your one kid. That is the logic of universalism. It's insane, and it leads to the domination of the breeders, right? And Mentem may actually have some sympathy with this view that I'm putting forth. Of course, come to very different conclusions based on this realization. Okay, so it's really stupid. If you think about it for a few seconds, it breaks down. It reduces to absurdity almost instantaneously. And moreover, people don't actually live this way. They will vote this way, but they don't actually live this way. Now, I mean, people, of course, in their day-to-day life, whenever you buy, like, a Starbucks coffee, okay, well, say you buy, like, a Starbucks Frappe Pupa Mocha, whatever, okay, for $4, okay, oh, well, that $4, that could have fed a little child in Africa for a month or whatever, right? You know that, but you chose the few seconds of the latte instead of feeding the kid in Sub-Saharan Africa for 4 months. By your actions, we can tell that that's your priorities, okay? And when I do that, I'm aware of that. That is my priorities. Now, you can call me a monster for pointing that out. Okay, well, first off, I'm not judging one negatively for doing such a thing, right? Because I don't buy into the cult of universalism. So when you buy the mocha, instead of feeding the Sub-Saharan African kid for a month, I'm just pointing out what you're doing. I don't, I'm not saying that it's wrong for you to do that. I don't think it's wrong for you to do that. I don't think you have any obligation to this kid just because it exists. Right? Like imagine a poor kid, taking food out of a dumpster or whatever, some pathetic situation. Now, should the rich people around this kid be forced to pay for this kid? Okay, if your answer is yes, well, let me ask you, should they be forced to pay for this kid if this kid did not exist? Right? If this kid was not, eating trash out of the dumpster? Should they be forced to pay for the kid that does not exist? The answer, of course, is no. This is not a trick question. The answer is no. Right? So their being required to pay is contingent upon this person coming into existence. That's the absurdity right there. Now, anyway, back to your daily life. In one's daily life, people don't actually act this way. Now, they will vote this way, okay? But that's a lot easier to do because your vote doesn't matter. Your vote is not going to actually change the outcome of an election. For example, if you live in, say, California and you vote for Barack Obama, that's not going to make Barack Obama any more likely to become president to any real degree. I mean, it's a teeny tiny, infinitesimally unlikely chance that your vote will actually change the outcome of an election. Okay, so what a person who has these abstract universal values will do is they'll go vote, knowing that their vote doesn't actually do anything. They know this. Everyone knows this. Okay, and then they can sleep well at night knowing that they're a good progressive person. That they hold to these insane, retarded progressive values that they have been taught are good values. But when their vote, quote unquote, does matter, right? Vote in the sense of they cast the one and only and deciding vote on how to spend their money. Well, they routinely choose the frappy Pupa Mocha over feeding the African kid for a month, right? So when their vote, in a sense, does matter, they vote anti-universalism. When their vote doesn't matter, then they can vote, these kind of airy, retarded ideals that they haven't really even thought through. Okay. Now I contend, and several others have contended, that these kinds of nutso ideals come from Christianity, or at least come from a Christian influence. They come from the idea that everyone's equal and the same before the eyes of God. Now, what's odd is that this kind of moral equivalence of all humans has transmuted into a descriptive equivalence in terms of, well, there's been a bit of a decline. I mean, first off, at the very beginning, before you had any real knowledge of heredity, you had people who were absolute blank slatists. Right? You had the complete wackos who said, well, give me the man at age 6 and I'll basically turn him in, and I can basically turn any individual into a criminal, a doctor, an astrophysicist, or whatever. Right? You had these complete, anti-biology, anti-evolution absolutists. Okay, that and that doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, those kinds of insane environmentalist ideas basically went to the same place that racial essentialism went. Okay, so a lot of people will point out how, well, in the past there were these insane, absolutist racial typology, racial essentialist views, okay, that went the wayside. Okay, that's true. That's true. There were really dumb ideas on that side of the spectrum. But let's not forget that there were equally dumb ideas on the other side of the spectrum. Absolutist blank slaters. Who are just as dumb and are just as gone right now. Okay. Moreover, if you look at, say, in the 1950s, it was funny. In the 1950s, you had people saying that there was no race differences in athletic abilities. Now, once Africans started to participate in the Olympics more and more, this farce couldn't really be kept up, and so the idea of racial physical strength and speed equality, that really couldn't be kept up. Now, why would they do this? Why would there be such a desire to have to say that the world is flat? I mean, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing a desire to play up and exaggerate the equality of individuals, to blur distinctions, to blur the innateness of traits, to try to find correlations. Say, oh, look, rich people have higher IQs. It must be the income that's causing it. Okay, well, maybe, in people who are smarter tend to make a little bit more money on the average. I mean, exceptions, blah, 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 all snowflakes, right? But why would that be? Why would there be this desire to say such obviously anti-scientific, anti-biology, anti-material things? And that's really what I'm seeing. For example, like, I'll talk about race physical differences. I mean, there's uncontroversial race physical differences in the bones, in liver function, in heart function, all over the body, even in the nervous system. Right, in terms of susceptibility to various nervous diseases, in terms of reaction times. Nobody really has much of a problem with this. They only have a problem when you get to the brain. Now, what's funny is that the brain itself is actually an extension of the nervous system, which no one has problems with race differences in the nervous system outside of the brain. Only when you get up into the part of the nervous system that is the brain, then suddenly everything has to be equal, right? And now, moreover, in the past, you did have this absolute blank slater stuff, but that's basically gone the wayside. Now, but this creates kind of an absurd situation where, individuals can have innate differences in cognitive ability, right? Albert Einstein, for example, and there's all sorts of smart people, right? There are innate differences in cognitive ability, right? And when I say cognitive ability, I'm not proclaiming that there's one single uniform measure of cognitive ability. Even in an IQ test itself, there are subtests, right? There's visual, spatial, pattern recognition. There's all sorts of subtests. So even the IQ test doesn't. I mean, it will give you one final number, okay, but that's an aggregate of multiple subtests, and you can look at the subtests within the IQ. I mean, even the people who push IQ are not saying that there is one intelligence, okay, although they do say that there is a general intelligence factor, but that's another issue. So this idea of racial equality, I mean, so obviously individuals can have innate differences in cognitive abilities. Arbitrary groups of individuals can have innate differences in cognitive abilities. Right? If for example, you took a group of people who spent many generations at the top of the mountain and a group of people who spent many generations at the foothills of the mountain, they're probably going to have some innate cognitive difference to some degree. Right? Maybe it'll have to do with balance. Maybe the people who live at the top of the mountain have better balance. Maybe people who live at the bottom of the mountain have better social skills because they live around more people, and people who had better social skills did better at breeding, whereas if you live at the tippy top of the mountain, balance is more important to reproductive success. I don't know. But if you have any two groups separated for any period of time, you're going to have, innate cognitive differences between those groups, assuming the environments are different. Right? This is pretty basic stuff. When talking about animals, there's no problem talking about this stuff. When talking about, for example, subspecies of coyotes, wolves, bears, or whatever, wild horses, various other mammals with similar global ranges to humans, right? We have no problem speaking frankly in this way. But it's only when you get into humans that this absolute descriptive equality comes to bear. Now, I look at this absolute descriptive equality as similar to, it's akin to a biblical creationism in that, it's denying evolution. It's denying evolution to a degree. And the reason it's doing it is because of values, right? They want the world to be flat, right? And so they try to make the world flat. Because universalism, because equality. Why universalism and equality? Well, I believe the historical roots of that come from the Bible. Now, you can point to various passages in the Bible that condone slavery, that condone all sorts of horrible inequalities, and you can find people who are going to bring up, inegalitarian passages from the Bible, cram it. Okay, just cram it. I don't care what Scripture says. Okay, quite frankly, I don't care what the Bible says. I care about Christianity as a historical institution. Now, historically, during the Middle Ages, you had the Catholic Church supporting the divine right of kings. That was obviously a very inegalitarian thing. Okay, but at its root, you look at Jesus' teachings. Jesus is saying, everyone can go to heaven. Everyone is equal before the eyes of God, and there's some debate as to whether or not they're going to be judged by their deeds, or if they just have to accept Jesus and they're automatically in. I mean, that's kind of a debate, but there's basically equality before the eyes of God. Okay, and when you look at, for example, the rhetoric of Martin, all right, the plagiarizing theologian, quote unquote doctor, not a real doctor, preacher, fundy fucktard. Martin, he talks about it in terms of, equality before the eyes of God. We are all children of God, right? He's referencing the Bible to invoke some sort of equality. And now you could say that, well, people also invoke the Bible to support slavery. Yeah, and I view that the invoking of the Bible to uphold slavery as similar to invoking of the Bible to uphold feudalism. But what's interesting is that even though they would invoke the Bible to uphold feudalism and slavery, which are basically operationally the same, and yeah, they are. I mean, peasants would be whipped if they tried to escape. Peasants could be impressed and sent off to war. Okay, lords would rape peasant women. Okay, the parallels are like everywhere. They, in feudalism, they were called lords. In the U.S., they were called master. Right. The parallels are very close. Right. They're operationally the same. And from a day-to-day life perspective, it's basically the same thing. In fact, well, I'm of the opinion that U.S. slaves had a higher standard of living than peasants did under feudalism, but that's another issue for another time. Anyway, that's just a long. This is kind of a long sort of response. The point being is that what is called progressivism is really universalism. Now, universalism can take multiple manifestations. Libertarians, by and large, are universalists in this mold. It's just that libertarians have slightly more advanced understandings of economics, not very good understandings of economics. I'm not saying that libertarians are smart on economics, but they're smarter. They're definitely smarter than, say, Krugman. Right? They're definitely smarter than, say, the Harvard economics department. All right, those monstrous morons. And so they have a different view. They have a different interpretation of the facts, but they still have the same value: the utility of all humanity. Okay, and because of this, but because they have a different view of the facts, they support a different means to the same end, which is the utility of all humanity. Okay, not even questioning those ends. And so, in that sense, most libertarians are at heart progressives. Right? Most libertarians are at heart progressives. There are some who aren't. Right? Murray Rothbard perhaps was not. Even that's debatable. So if you look at like the Cato Institute, their policy on immigration, you look at the Mises Institute, their policy, they're all open borders. They're all open borders advocates. Rothbard would be rolling over in his grave. So yeah. So Luddite was talking about this kind of what happens when God is dead. Well, God is dead, but the music is still playing, and that music is progressivism. Oh, another thing we could talk about is democracy. I mean, a lot of people advocate democracy. Democracy in your day-to-day life, like people don't do it. In the workplace, you can have a very limited democracy, like in terms of voting on, how to set up a server. You could take a vote on that. But even that's really, like, for example, when I was at work, we were setting up some new servers. We took a vote on how to set up the logical structure. And we took a vote, okay, but the vote was limited, not only within the company, but it was limited within the people who were working on that thing, right? And so you can see democracy, democracy as it exists in an emergent fashion, not dictated by like some state plan, tends to be like that. It's not this mass democracy. So I want to draw a distinction between the kind of informal, colloquial, let's raise your hand sort of democracy to real, ideological mass democracy. Like, let's vote on a president. Let's have a Senate or a House, right? Those, like, there's obviously a clear difference between those two things. Okay. Now, democracy is basically the idea of, anyone can vote on how much you pay and where your money goes, right? So, you could have a Group A, voting themselves the resources of Group B. Or maybe not themselves, but maybe voting other people's money to go to things that they like as opposed to the people who have that money, right? And so democracy, ultimately, it just breaks down into voting wars. And that's what democracy is. It's different groups. Every, election cycle, they try to mass mob their policies down the other side's throats. That's all democracy is. It's kind of insane. It's also inherently communist. And a lot of people say, "Oh, he's calling something communist. That's right wing. That's what right wing kooks say. So I'm just going to ignore anything from this point on." Well, hear me out here. When you vote on the tax rate of someone, let's say you have a democracy and the people vote to raise someone's taxes by 5%. What's the implication there? The implication is that these people can do that, right? That is, these people can decide how much everyone else pays for these things, okay? The implication, and the reason they can do that, the implication of that is that everyone owns everything in common ultimately, right? Now, you may, quote-unquote, own your private business, but if there's enough votes, and you can also say, well, there's legal barriers, blah, 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 I eat my poop, okay? But ultimately, if there's enough votes, anyone can vote themselves anything of yours, okay? Your business, quote-unquote, what you call your business, can be voted away from you at any time if that be what the mob desire, okay? So what this means is that ultimately the voting population owns everything in the United States, okay, in common. Ultimately, they own everything in common. So an implicit assumption in democracy is communism. That is, the voters own everything, ultimately. Now, it is a kind of a la carte communism. That is, it is ultimately communistic, but in democracies, the population tends to allow a certain level of contingent ownership. You contingently own your house. You contingently own your car basically because the mob has not decided to take it away from you. But they could at any time, because ultimately they're the ultimate owners of it, right? And of course, nobody actually owns land. Like if you're paying property tax on a land, that's not. I mean, you don't own it, right? If you're paying someone to keep it, it's not yours, right? Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say here. I really don't know how to conclude this. Just a way of saying that what Luddite Romantic was talking about first and foremost applies to people like Hannibal Victor, Dana Garrett, these kinds of post-Christian monster morons, universalist shit-eaters who hold insane values that reduce to absurdity with the most cursory analysis, universalism. Democracy is democracy is going to be remembered like we remember communism as being absolutely insane, and we are kind of shocked that it lasted as long as it did. That's how democracy is going to be remembered. And so people are going to wonder, well, why did the United States as a democracy last as long as it did? Well, the reason it lasted as long as it did is because this democracy, for a long period of time, allowed a high level of contingent private property. Not real private property, but contingent private property, in that the mob wasn't taking it away from people. That's why it lasted so long. Basically, the democracy lasted as long as it did because it wasn't being fully democratic. It allowed the market to operate to a certain degree. Okay, and so democracy is going to be remembered like that. Universalism is absolutely insane, and it comes from Christianity. It comes and these universalist norms are promulgated through universities, and the universities themselves are just a continuation of the old cathedral schools. These psychological, like the people who are ultra progressives today, they would have been the inquisitors back in during the Inquisition, right? Because these people they are zealots for the status quo. That's what they are. They're taking what they learn in the cathedrals, come universities, and they're saying this is absolute. Anyone who doesn't believe this is some sort of evil thing, right? They're for global warming. Now, I don't want to get into the facts of the matter on global warming. I'm dealing more with kind of the psychology here. For example, on global warming, well, if you deny what the professors say, right? In the old days, it was the priesthoods, but now it's the professors. If you deny what the professors say, you are a denier, right? And a denier carries similar weight to heretic, right? If you disagree with what the professors say about, whatever, you're a right-wing, reactionary, racist. Right? If you don't hold this insane universalist values, if you don't hold the retarded kind of Santa Claus support for for democracy, kind of a Freudian slip there, but basically they're one and the same, just varying degrees. That you're all sorts of evil names. If you don't, if you apply evolution consistently, right, i.e. to humans in an obvious way, then that's racist, right, which is similar to heretic. And oh, that's another point I want to say. Biblical creationists, their denial of evolution is more coherent because they deny it outright. They have a complete top to bottom denial of what is called macroevolution. Of course, the term macroevolution was a term created by the creationists. It's not a real. It's just a gradient. I mean, there's no line where you go from micro to macroevolution. Although I guess I'm making the continuum fallacy here. Anyway, their denial of evolution is more coherent because it's top to bottom, whereas the post-Christians, who can be seen, in fact, progressives can actually be seen as as a sect of Christianity, because you look at Christianity developing over time, it becomes, there are some reactions. Okay, you have some Puritans who actually go back to a more fundamentalist Christianity, and so you have sects here and there that kind of push back, but the direction, basically since the Protestant Reformation, the direction of Christianity has been towards leniency, has been towards more and more openness. Eventually, I mean, today, that's obviously, I think the apocalypse of Christianity has been when basically all, I don't know the statistics exactly, but when you have sects of Christianity allowing homosexuals in, allowing homosexual preachers. I mean, that I think is basically the bellwether for the end of Christianity as we know. I mean, and so what you see is Christianity breaking down, becoming more lenient, becoming less socially conservative over time, and progressivism is what I see it as basically a secular extension of Christianity. That is, they have outright denied that they're a sect of Christianity that has denied God, Jesus, and the Bible, basically. But they're still universalists. They still hold that universalism and the idea of equality of people, like some weird sort of moral equality. It's not. I mean, the idea of equality breaks down because if you look at, for example, the markets for adopting children, children are not valued equally. European children are valued more. Girls are valued more than boys. There's no equality there. Not even at birth. Not even at birth are people valued equally. If you say, "Oh, that's market value," that's not the kind of value. Well, if you're not referring to market value, then what are you talking about? You're talking about the kinds of value of others that people. Well, that's obviously not true. It's obviously not true that. I mean, in terms of the subjective valuation of people. For example, if I went to some atheist meetup, I would be valued far less than anyone else there. Right? I would have negative value. They would hate me. Right? So obviously there's no equality in terms of this sort of non-market subjective valuation of people. Parents value their kids more than other kids. There's no equality in terms of this kind of non-market personal sentiment. There's no equality in terms of market sentiment. There's no equality in terms of physical or cognitive abilities. Equality is a completely completely fabricated social construct. Is what equality is. But this completely fabricated social construct of equality, and of course it's obvious when you actually look at it from the outside. If you're in the cult, you're not going to see it, but if you're outside the cult, it's obvious to you that there is no equality. That equality is NA. Like, no. Like, nature doesn't do equal. But if you're in the cult, that's going to be what you're going to think. And that I contend, comes from Christianity. Now, when I say it comes from Christianity, well, first off, the institutional progression is right there. The universities are clearly an extension of the church. Their institutional development directly comes from that. It's undeniable. Okay, they don't deny. Harvard doesn't deny this. Okay, so from an institutional standpoint, that's what they are. The same kinds of people in these positions, right? Formerly priests, now professors, right? Formerly Christians, now progressives. Formerly heretics, now racists. Formerly blasphemers, now climate change deniers. Right? And I don't and these what is the current scientific consensus on global warming may actually be correct. I'm not talking about that here. I'm talking about the psychology here. Right? I see it as a complete as just a straight up extension of this. And you look at their and of course what the fundamentalist Christians would do is they would have their science. They would make anti-scientific views that stem from their values, right? For example, the biblical creationists are a great example of that. Don Exodus might argue that otherwise, but argue that Christianity doesn't need creationism. But I think most creationists, most Christians support some sort of creationism, be it intelligent design, because they recognize that that's what the Bible says, and so they have an ideological overlay over the science, and so they don't just let the science speak for itself. Progressives do that, except they do it with race. Right? There's an excellent article in Slate called "Liberal Creationism," and it's basically the same thing. So there's all these parallels. And so when Luddite Romantic, and so that's just what I wanted to say in this video. It's like a 45-minute video. But that's what, when Luddite Romantic was talking about, God is dead, but the music is still playing. Well, yeah, God is dead, and the music is still playing, and the post-Christians go by the name of, Rational Wiki. That's a post-Christian site. Skeptical Science, that's a post-Christian site. Free Thought Blogs, that's a post-Christian. This is all post-Christianity, okay? And their vehement hatred of the more mystical forms of Christianity that still accepts Jesus and God and all the the magical things in the Bible. Of course, only the ones they want. They kind of pick and choose from the Bible what they want. I think their vehement hatred of the religious Christianity has something to do with them being so close to each other, with them being so similar. They're both universalists, right? Similar to how Marxists and anarchists are at each other's throats all the time. Trotskyites and Maoists are at each other's throats all the time, right? It's very strange. You see, groups, ideological groups that are very close to each other have this really incredible hatred of each other, more hatred than they do for ideological groups that are further away. It's very odd, right? And of course, this whole the secular progressives and the more religious progressives also plays out in the Republican versus Democrat Party. Now, both the Republican and Democrat Party both believe in the Bible, but to different degrees. We could say that Republicans in general believe in the Bible more than the Democrats do. Okay, and so the atheists, the completely atheistic progressives, they're in their conflict with the fundamentalist creationist types is simply a more extreme version of the conflict between the more secular progressives in the Democrat Party and the more religious progressives in the Republican Party. The Republican Party is not nearly as religious as, say, Nephilim Free on the whole, and the Democrat Party is not nearly as atheistic as, say, Coughlin. Okay. Right, and of course, I mean, the Republicans Party is ultra progressive party as well. And people say no, Republicans they're anti. No, they're totally progressive, right? Look at, for example, what did George Bush do? He had a guest worker program. George Bush expanded, had the prescription drug program, had the No Child Left Behind program, which, whatever your opinions of the efficacy of it are, it was clearly a progressive idea, a universalist idea, an equality-based idea. The idea that these racial inequalities need to go away because, the world is flat, right? Racial inequalities between students and schools should not exist, right? Their very existence is an evidence, is because biology doesn't exist in terms of humans and race. Any inequality between racial groups has to be down to some sort of environmental disparity that we then need to correct. That's the thinking behind No Child Left Behind. So George Bush was a racial egalitarian on that front. Part of his motivation for invading Iraq and Afghanistan was to spread democracy, i.e., this kind of communism, a la carte communism, to the Middle East. You can also point to the no-bid contracts and the oily dealings and all that, but if George Bush was only interested in helping his oil buddies, there are far easier ways to do that. Okay, part of the motivation for the war in Iraq, well, part of it had to do with the petrodollar, but also, there is a large ideological movement that says the United States it is the burden of the United States to invade the world in order to spread the fruits of democracy. Right? It's a crusade. It's a religious crusade. That we need to spread our kind of secularized progressive religion to the Middle East, to these backwards Middle Eastern peoples who don't embrace democracy the way we do. And moreover, if you compare for example, the platform of Mitt Romney versus Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I mean, we would all say FDR was a progressive, right? Of course we would. Okay, well, Mitt Romney supported far more welfare than Roosevelt ever did. I mean, Roosevelt did not advocate, he later did advocate Social Security, but Roosevelt did not support Medicare, Medicaid, generalized income security programs. Roosevelt did not support the ending segregation. Now, maybe you could say in his heart of hearts he wanted to, but in terms of the actual policy that was put forth by Roosevelt, that was not put forth. Okay. The immigration policy of Roosevelt was, during Roosevelt's era, was basically white-only. For the most part, there's some exceptions, but for the most part, it was a white-only immigration policy. Mitt Romney did not come forth and say, we need to go back to the white-only immigration policy. No, the Republican Party supports non-European immigration to the United States. Okay? And so that's a universalist idea that is breaking away from the from the European racial identity that the United States was founded with. I mean, Mitt Romney, I don't know what Mitt Romney's stance on gay marriage is. I don't know, don't care. But Mitt Romney, but look, we can look at other things. Mitt Romney, if you asked him, he would oppose anti-race mixing laws. He would oppose sodomy laws. Okay, the Republican platform across the board. If you look at the Republican from a historical standpoint, compared to what has existed in history for most of history, the Republican Party is rabidly progressive. In fact, the Republican Party, the positions, if you look at the Republican Party, 25 years ago would have been considered progressive. So that's basically what the Republicans are. The Republicans basically are what would have been considered progressive about 25 years ago. So when we're looking at the Republicans and Democrats, it's all progressives, right? It's all progressive infighting. It's all post-Christian infighting. Everyone holds universalist values. Nephilim Free, for example, he holds universalist values, and Nephilim Free makes these videos attacking, atheistic progressivism because, Darwin is connected to the scientific racialists. And the atheist progressives are absolutely retarded. And of course, they fabricate history. They revise history in bogus ways by saying that Darwin was anti-racist, or that Darwin did not enthusiastically support Galton's eugenics, right? Which, of course, Darwin did. Darwin was a fan of what Galton was doing with eugenics. And, of course, even that polymath of fail, Stephen Jay Gould, recognizes that scientific racialism basically came into being as we know it. I mean, there were some theories beforehand, but scientific racialism as we know it really came into being with Charles Darwin. Okay, and that's coming from Gould. Okay, um, and that's obviously true. Um, so yeah, that's just what I wanted to say. These people who say they're the rational, the free thing, like these and that's another big red flag. These self-congratulatory titles like I'm a skeptic, or I'm a free thinker, I'm rational, and of course Rational Wiki, like they have their. What's hilarious is that title is wrong. Okay, all rational means is means and ends, right? Rational means okay, you want to do X, what leads to X, right? Of course, in that sense, everyone considers themselves. I mean, they're using rational wrong. Okay, they don't know what rational really means. They think rational just means smart, or they're just using it as a synonym for smart. I be smart. I don't believe in God. I be smart, and I accept all the latest progressive science. Right. Ozone layers and CFCs, DDT, acid rain, secondhand smoke, nuclear winter. The Drake equation and the SETI program, right? All the progressive science that has been proven wrong up to this point. The latest in progressive science, right? Racial creationism. No, not racial. No, racial equality. Right, and that's what's really funny about it as well. Like Christians will often talk about the mind as this spiritual entity that is independent of the physical matter of the brain. And arguing with atheistic progressives, atheistic progressives will say, no, the mind is material, everything's material, blah blah blah. But then when you start talking about race, and you say, oh, the mind is material, look at the gross physical differences between the races. Now, I know Stephen Jay Gould, blah blah blah, Mismeasure of Man. Well, we have more modern methods that have basically vindicated the old scientific racialists. Moreover, Stephen Jay Gould, we know that he lied about Samuel George Morton. You can look that up. You can look up Samuel George Morton, Gould lied, and you'll find the New York Times article that talks about that. They actually remeasured Morton's skulls and found that Morton got it right, and Stephen Jay Gould was full of crap. So that calls into question, well, if Gould was wrong about one guy, how many others did he lie about? How many others of his quote-unquote corrections were, a crock of shit, especially knowing that in the main, the old scientific racialists that Gould is saying measured the cranial capacities wrong have been vindicated by more modern methods, right? It paints a pretty bleak picture for Gould, right? And Gould's a pretty nasty, awful person, right? And all his ideas are wrong. His ideas on punctuated equilibrium. Never mind. I don't want to get into that. Point being that I look at the brain as like a physical thing. I see, look at these races. They differ in, not only do they differ in total size of the brain, but they also differ in white versus gray matter usage. For example, Africans tend to use more white matter, whereas Europeans tend to use more gray matter proportionately. There's different lobe sizes. For example, Africans have larger orbitofrontal cortexes. What does that mean in particular? I don't know or care particularly what that means, but what it means generally, more importantly, is that there are gross physical differences in the brains between the races. Right? And this is generally accepted. I mean, there was a time in the 80s when people saying there weren't, but more modern data has basically said, yeah. I mean, post-Gould data has basically vindicated the old scientific racialists that, yes, there are differences in brain size and shape. Now, what kind of a joke of a coincidence, given that the races differ in basically every other part of the body, in the bones, in the nervous system, in the muscles, in the muscle type and fiber, they differ everywhere. Why equality in the brain? Now, some people will say, well, there are no races. Define for me in mathematical, apodictic terms what the races are. Like, I mean, this is just category denial. And what they'll do is they'll point, well, they fuzzily blend into each other here, the races do, so therefore they don't exist. Therefore, there are no differences. Like, and I'm just going to say, if you don't want to believe in race, fine. Call them whatever you want to call them. Like, but clearly black people exist. All right. If you don't want to call them a race, well, if they're not a separate race, well, clearly they're a separate something. Right. And these groups, and we could say that these groups historically called races do differ in brain size and shape, right? And I think that's basically the end of it. The basic impossibility and the obvious political motivations for saying that evolution stopped at the neck in humans for a period of time, right? That's what they're saying. The period in which races differentiated, the past 150,000 years, maybe 100,000 years, maybe a little bit less, but during that period where you had all these racial differentiations in every other part of the body, no, the brain's off limits, right? In the one part of the body where it became impolitic to do so, that's where there's equality, right? And there's not equality amongst individuals or between any particular arbitrary group of individuals. But as soon as the groups being compared correspond to the classical races, then there's equality in the brain. Right, and it's amazing. I get people saying, "Well, there's stabilizing selection," right? No environment would select more for intelligence than another, or for any cognitive trait than another, which is insane. I could say, okay, well, strength is obviously a good thing, therefore all races are equal in strength. No, there's a cost to that, just like there's a cost to cognitive ability. Okay, brains aren't, and when talking about animals, we get this. We understand that there's a cost and a benefit to cognitive ability, right? You look at nature shows, I mean, there's that one nature clip talking about how various animals have the budget model of the brain. Well, yeah, they have the budget model of the brain because, yeah, having a bigger brain has benefits, but it also has a cost, right? So, and of course, bigger brains, what necessarily do they do? For example, whales and dolphins have huge brains. What do? Well, they appear to be for navigation. That also explains why Inuits have extremely large brains, but they don't have correspondingly high IQs. However, Inuits do have exceptional visual spatial abilities, as they have the ability to navigate large distances and excellent understanding of spatial relationships. On like, for example, fold this cube up. What will it look like? What's on the other side of this die or whatever. Like, the Eskimos are very excellent at those kinds of visual spatial tasks. Males also excel at those visual spatial tasks. In fact, if you remove the visual spatial subtests from IQ tests, the male-female IQ gap goes away entirely. Right? Males do generally score higher on IQ tests. I know there was an article by Flynn, who showed an example, a sample of females who scored higher on an IQ test than males. It's like, okay, well, there's more examples in the opposite direction. Okay, anyway, but if you remove visual spatial subtests, the male-female IQ gap goes away entirely, right? And so that explains the larger male brain. That males have much larger brains, but much larger brains than their higher IQs would warrant. For example, it's like 2 points higher, but the brain size of males is much bigger than. For example, if you assumed a linear scale of brain size to IQ, you would assume males have a much higher IQ relative to females than they actually do. Okay, but they don't. So what this is evidence of is that visual spatial abilities require a lot of brain mass for whatever reason. Whales, for example, are basically, first of all, whales, their brains, a lot of their brain is used to just manage their body. But also, it's used to navigate the world, right? Whales can navigate oceans by dead reckoning, right? So, that clearly, that brain has the ability to do that. Eskimos can perform amazing navigational feats across Alaska and Siberia. Okay, and the Eskimos tend to perform exceptionally well on visual spatial tests. Males, by anecdote, have historically been the navigators, and males perform exceptionally better on visual spatial tests. So that's kind of a tangent there. Just dealing with the brain size and cognitive functions thing. The more important point is that there's differences. There's physical differences. And you have all these materialists, these atheist progressive materialists, who suddenly become mystics regarding the mind as soon as race differences are invoked. I say, oh, look, the brain is a material thing, right? Mind is grounded in the material of the brain. Okay, and look, the material brain is clearly different between these racial groups. So what are the odds that they're going to be, what are the odds that the underlying mind, the underlying cognitive function, the behaviors are going to be exactly the same, innately? And it's a cosmic joke of a coincidence to believe that they would be the same, given their gross physical differences. But as soon as you bring this up, as soon as you say, hey, look, these two groups of people have clear differences in muscle, right? They say, oh, you can't analogize the brain to muscle because the brain involves a mind that is non-material, right? They suddenly become they suddenly become non-materialists as soon as you bring up race differences in brain morphology, right? Everywhere else, they're hard materialistic scientists. But then when you start to bring up the brain, suddenly that materialism goes out the window, right? So it's a clear, obvious hypocrisy based on insane values. Okay. I think I'm done with this video. That was a long video response. Most shit-eater atheist cultists are not going to listen to this whole thing. But I think Luddite will, and I've actually grown more and more fond of Luddite and his videos. I know Luddite is having a problem here because he's wanting to explore things and be honest and about issues. But I'm just going to tell you, Luddite, you're going to have a hard time. He's kind of playing it down a little bit. He's kind of tiptoeing, around talking about politically incorrect things. And when I say politically incorrect things, I mean things that are actually politically incorrect. Bashing feminism is not politically incorrect, right? If you make a video attacking something and you get a bunch of butt pats for doing that, you're not being politically incorrect. If it's easy to do, if you can get kudos for saying it, it's not politically incorrect. Okay, feminism is not politically correct at this point, right? It seems that way, but it's not. It does not have majority support. The politically correct position on YouTube in regards to feminism is anti-feminism, right? So Integral Math thinks he's being an independent thinker by bashing feminism. No. But anyway, that's kind of what Luddite's doing here. Luddite is kind of trying to tiptoe and because he wants to say interesting things. He wants to explore concepts in an honest and in an honest way that allows the mind to run free without the shackles of universalist or equalitarian presuppositions. But I'm going to tell you, Luddite, you're going to have, if you try to do that, you're going to have a bad time. Because these monsters are not going to allow that. These monsters have their cult, right? They have their inquisitions, they have their witch hunts, and they do not allow deviation from these insane values. And their whole description of the world is distorted by these insane values. And when they'll attack Republicans or they'll attack libertarians with all the fury that the Jesuits will attack the Methodists. That's what this is. I mean, they're all progressives, they're all post-Christians, and they're like post-Christian sects attacking each other. And of course the Jesuits will attack the Methodists with far more fury than they'll attack Muslims, for example, right? Because it's this whatever it is, people like to infight, and that's what libertarianism versus, I guess you could call it welfare state progressivism is. It's just two different sects of the same religion going at each other. They have their own little twist, like the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, they're all basically the same species. I guess you could call them, I guess you could see them as like subspecies of Christianity. And post-Christianity, post-Christian progressivism can be seen as kind of like a Neanderthal, or maybe a Homo sapiens. Maybe you could see it as like Homo sapiens compared to Christianity, which is like Neanderthal. And both Neanderthal and sapiens have subspecies. There's subspecies of Neanderthal and subspecies of Homo sapiens, but they're all kind of closely related, and they're all, they come from each other. Okay, that's it. Anyway, so yeah, Luddite, you're going to have a hard time doing what you're trying to do. I can tell what you're trying to do. I can tell that you're trying to be intellectually honest and open. You saw what happened with your Cult of Dusty video, and you didn't even say anything really that bad in that video. You didn't really even say anything debatable in that video. I mean, what you said in that Cult of Dusty video was obviously true. I mean, but even then, you got like 40 thumbs up, 30 thumbs down. Imagine when you say something that is actually, has some teeth to it. When you start talking about some actually politically incorrect things, you're going to get mobbed. Right? So that's just what I'm saying. So, I mean, just maybe you're going to retreat back. Maybe you're just going to go back into this kind of highfalutin esoteric philosophy, so you can make your videos and still enjoy the warm bath of YouTube atheism. Maybe you'll choose that path. But if you want to get out there, if you want, for example, what's his face, Dewada Man started making his videos on the Zimmerman thing, okay, he started making videos, supporting evolution in humans, i.e. race realism or whatever, and so he got attacked for that, right? And that's what happened to you. So, just saying.